Okay, maybe we can start.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Start recording.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's always a pleasure seeing you and discussing with you. So welcome to this Transforming Education Summit debriefing call. As you all know, the summit sought to mobilize political ambition, action, solutions, and solidarity to transform education and mainly to reimagine education systems for the world of today and tomorrow, and obviously to revitalize national and global efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 4. So as you can remember, the pre-summit happened in Paris on 28 to 30 of June. And the summit itself just happened in New York on 16 to 19 of September. So after rounds of consultations, finalized action tracks, papers, and discussions where GCE had a meaningful participation. Now it's time to start asking ourselves what is next and how we can mobilize GCE members to call governments into account. Then this webinar is aiming at addressing these questions throughout the comments of colleagues who attended the summit in New York. So this is the aim of this call. So we have several speakers locally, and each speaker will have up to 7 minutes to present their views. Just remember that we have interpretation in all languages, so you just have to look at the globe below your screen and click on the language you prefer. And at the end of the speeches, we will have the time for an open discussion. So this is a very participatory call where everyone can participate, can take the floor if you wish. So let me start with the GCE president, our dear colleague Rifat Saba, for making the opening remarks, and then we will follow with the other colleagues. So Rifat, you have up to 7 minutes for your presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Werner, and thanks for GCE Secretariat to organize this debriefing session. As all of you know, that the summit in New York was tend to be political summit, not technical. So this is the importance of this summit. As GCE, we started actually because we are member of the advisory committee of the summit, as well as we are part of the steering committee. And all of you know that GCE has been involved in the 5 tracks, all the discussion that happened in the last year. And I can say that GCE did well in be involving not just in the global meetings that happened regarding the 5 tracks, but also at the regional level, whereas GCE also through their regional coalitions, they succeed to engage as much as they can the whole GCE member in the discussion that happened regarding the 5 tracks. Sure, from my point of view, the pre-summit in Paris may be much important than the summit that happened in New York regarding the technical issue, the discussion, the visions, because, as I said, in New York, it was political. So it was for me one of the most important spaces that I attended. I never attended a high-level like a meeting like this, where we meet not just civil society, but also governments from different countries, and it gave us also opportunity to hear closely from these officials how they think and how far they will go beyond the summit. As you know that GCE, all of the delegation, and I think most of us attended the 3 days, which is the 16th, where is the Youth Day, the 17th, the Solution Days, where it is the side events, and the 19th. In the 16th also was also the opportunity to hear from the youth, and here I think we have to also to improve the role of the GCE in strengthening the youth constituencies all over the world, because in attending different sessions, I can say that not all the session was at the same of the political level that we expected. So we have to reposition ourselves in this movement. I mean, the youth movement inside all the educational movement in general. And as Muhammad mentioned, that the TES will not be implemented really effectively if there is no global movement to put pressure on all countries in order to go forward in this. So in the Youth Day, I think what the lesson learned that as GCE, we have really to strengthen the voice of the youth much more than it is. And I want to thank the global students for their role and for their work, also in order to put more energy in the youth voice from revolutionary point of view. In the Solutions Day, we were also at GCE attending many sessions. GCE has just in financing, and I think the Solution Day, it was also a very good opportunity because it gave us more space and more time to be involved in with all the with many governments. Personally, it was for me a very great opportunity to because I met many officials from different countries, and I can say that sometimes we put some any vague impression towards the government, but those who we met, really they expressed their willing to go forward when it came to the education. And all of the governments, they said that there is education crisis, but there is no one from all the governments, but they attended, they said opposite of this. So this is all the governments, all the people that they were there, they recognize the risky of the education crisis if there is no action after a while. And there is something I notice, and this is the first time that I noticed that there is a lot of discussion about financing, which it came to my mind when they discuss the financing issue. They go far a little bit from the task justice and all these austerities and the debt issue. So this is the role of GCE to raise the voice. It came to the necessarily of cancellation of the debt, also the necessarily when you are working on the domestic financing to reinforce your tax justice system, because I didn't see a lot of talk when the ministries speak about these things. Another things I noticed that this is when it came to the decision makers, because the ministers of education, they are not the decision makers. That's why their discourse kept in some level that they didn't able even to give decisions, because the decisions go to the state or to the ministries of finance, which is, I think, in the next period, we have to target the ministers of finance because they are the difficult people in the governments. Because what they are thinking just to keep the financing. In the 19th, we had the chance also. I was, from my personal experience, I was a moderator of a session in the education crisis, which UNESCO and GBE and UNICEF organized, and I was moderator for 7 governments, which is for me, this is the first time where I was a little bit worried about how they will deal with the session, but it was, for me, much more than I expected. It went very well. We had chance even to continue with them in some discussion. So it gave me also another lesson that in the next time, I think GCE, they have to work more in order to even to secure more number from GCE, from the coalition, from the regional coalition, from the national coalition to be attending like this summit. There is 6, actually, I can say that these 6 sessions that I attended in like session titles of 6 titles of sessions that I attended, it was very important to hear the people. Education in a crisis situation, the learning crisis, which is the climate change. This is also another topic. They speak about transform the world. The digital learning, which is also had chance to attend these sessions. Also, advancing gender equality. While the 6th is the financing education. And in each session, there is where really agreement among all the attendants. For example, when it came to the education in a crisis, they agree in the action that they have to protect and improve the external financing. They agree to work together in the spirit of international cooperation. Also, they agree to take into account diverse crises affected by the context. So this is very important actions in each title has been taking from that meeting to the outcome of the session. I don't know, Werner, if I still have time or...
No, I am afraid that your time is up
so,
now, but we will have time.
Let me close it, because yes, what I am saying that there is specific action in the 5 tracks, which is very important for GCE to also to refresh it and to gather the people to think how we can work in the coming period. This is the most important. How really we can strengthen the global movement and how we be a core actors in this global educational movement towards achieving the TES, and to put all the countries and all even the civil society under accountability for really engaging and rescue the world from the expected education crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Rifat, for your opening remarks and very important reflections on the summit. Now I'll give the floor to Samuel Dembele, GC's chair, to share his also his reflection, his thoughts. So Samuel, the floor is yours for 7 minutes, please. Are you there, Samuel? Let me see.
Hello?
Yeah.
Bonjour.
Go ahead, Samuel. Go ahead.
Ok. J'ai quelques problèmes de connexion. La connexion est très faible ici. Et c'est un peu général. Donc, je ne sais pas si on pourra m'attendre de façon régulière. Mais pour commencer, je voudrais d'abord féliciter l'organisation de ce débriefing après notre voyage. Je salue en passant tous ceux qui ont accepté de participer à cette activité. Et je me réjouis de pouvoir partager aussi avec vous mon sentiment après justement notre participation aux activités auxquelles nous avons pu accéder. Donc, d'abord, la journée de mobilisation avec justement une forte participation de la jeunesse. Il faut dire que ce que j'ai retenu de toutes les interventions, de tout ce que les gouvernants et les jeunes ont montré, l'enjeu principal au niveau de la jeunesse, c'est que c'est en moyenne, dans la plupart des pays en développement, 60% des populations. Donc 60% de ceux qui doivent être concernés par la transformation de l'éducation. Alors, ces chiffres ont été révélés, les propositions qui ont été faites, notamment par les gouvernants qui s'ouvrent, en tout cas, une considération de ce constat, c'est que la jeunesse a un grand rôle dans le futur avec justement l'ambition de transformer l'éducation. Alors, ce qui n'a pas été véritablement montré, c'est comment on va y arriver, comment on va transformer, avec qui. Et sur ce point, je n'ai pas beaucoup perçu le rôle des enseignants, comment on va aborder cette question et la manière d'organiser l'événement m'a même semblé aussi une insuffisance parce qu'il s'agissait de communication verticale, il n'y a pas d'échange interactif et donc c'est un ensemble de communications qu'on est venu en quelque sorte déverser et qui pour moi risque de ne pas avoir suffisamment d'impact. Et ce qui a été décidé après d'organiser d'autres événements, y compris l'aspect financier, montre bien que l'objectif principal n'a pas été véritablement développé à ce sommet. Donc, ce que nous devons faire au niveau de JCI, c'est d'orienter justement nos campagnes, nos politiques vers justement une dynamisation à notre sein de la jeunesse pour que justement ce que nous allons suggérer aux décideurs puisse justement avoir un impact réel sur le terrain avec leur participation. L'autre aspect, c'est faire une campagne pour recentrer justement les perspectives qui sont notamment comment tout cela va être financé. Je sais qu'il y a un autre sommet qui va venir parler du financement. Quel sera notre apport, notre rôle? Nous devons en tout cas développer des perspectives plus explicites que ce que nous avons pu vivre lors du sommet. Et donc, par rapport à cela, je pense que nous devons, avec nos membres, travailler beaucoup avec nos membres dans les différents pays pour refaire, en tout cas, un ensemble de données que nous allons valider pour faire un instrument de campagne. Alors, rapidement, bon, c'est ce que j'avais comme commentaire sur le sommet. mon sentiment. Je ne sais pas si j'ai pu être suivi tout le long de mon développement, mais je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Yes, we did hear you of your entire presentation. I think it was very substantive. Thank you so much. We will have time for comments at the end of the presentations. Now it is the turn to Nafisa Babu, also GC board member who attended the summit. So Nafisa, the floor is yours for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Werner. I hope you can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We can hear you very well.
Is it possible to hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yes, okay, greetings from Tanzania. So I will give a bit of an update on what has happened around disability inclusive education. And first, I'd like to thank all of our members who have helped to contribute to this moment where we wanted to raise attention around disability inclusive education and need for better investment. That's the GCE US, Site Savers, CDM, HI, Humanity Inclusion, and also Action Aid for their support through this process. So, you know, we had we developed a call to action around disability inclusive education for the summit that was asking for governments to make greater investment, at least 5% of their budgets towards disability inclusive education, taking into account the twin track approach around system-wide transformation and also looking at the specific needs of students with disabilities. And also wanted to, the other call was around all programs being 100% disability inclusive, and reaching at least 10% of its population or children that are reached the education program should be children with disabilities. And lastly, we also called for more donors to make sure that disability is a core criteria in accessing funding, and also the targets for reporting are also set. We had a great side event in collaboration with the International Disability Alliance and the International Disability and Development Consortium, which went off very well. We were also quite happy about how disability was represented throughout the summit in the mobilization day with the youth activists who spoke about the need to really support and include students with disabilities. On the solutions day, we had the comedian and actor Maysoon and authors Maysoon Zahid, who did a presentation. She was really great. And I know Amina Mohammed said she was one of the, mentioned as one of the most memorable presentations that she had on the day. And at the Leaders Day, we had Jose Ferreira from the International Disability Alliance highlighting this call to action. So,
Nafisa, we lost you.
Werner, I know she said that her
Yeah.
internet is limited. There she is.
Go ahead.
okay.
Nafisa.
Maybe I turn up the camera. So we had a great side event with a packed room, and we also had presentations from the Minister of the World Bank, FCDO as well presented at our session, as well as Education Cannot Wait. I'm sure I'm leaving out some others. It was really great young people who also presented, and a member from the European Parliament as well. So what happened in that event was really great. We had a challenge from the USAID, challenge the World Bank at reaching, who will be the first to get to 100% disability inclusion in all education programs. And they even took a great picture to kind of savor the moment, and that was cast it in stone. You know, if it's a tweet, it makes it real. So we had and the USAID Leanne Mars, she sorry, not USAID, she posted also on Twitter, which was really great to get some activity around the commitment. So when it comes to the analysis of some of the national commitments, about 60% of statements acknowledge the gaps in access and special access for persons with children with disabilities, the need for specialized teachers, adaptive programs and material. And these were mostly from low and middle income countries and countries affected by conflict. We also saw that the Secretary General's statement had 3 mentions of disability, which was really positive, in recognizing people with disabilities as a marginalized group. It also talks about education environments that need to be more supportive, and the importance of laws and policies that promote inclusion and combat stigma. And the vision also included recommendations to invest more equitably in education for the most marginalized and those who were traditionally left behind. So that was really positive. In terms of the Youth Declaration, there were also some great mentions around disability, around intersectionality, the need for full participation of all students in different learning environments, regardless of abilities, and the need for safe learning environments for all. And it was really good to see that that special focus was mentioned on girls with disabilities who also experience double discrimination. So what next from our end? So we have this great call to action. I think Jennifer could probably post, has posted it into we'll post it in the chat. We would really, really like you to endorse it. If your national coalition hasn't signed on, please sign on. Please share it with your members. Get them to sign on. We want to amplify the need to really invest more in disability inclusive education. So please share that. What's also happening is that we are putting a group together to track what has been track some of the commitments related to the call to action. And so this is also on the go. But what we really need is for you, your country, your the NGOs and CSOs that are part of your coalitions to sign out and show that children with disabilities really matter. Yes. And then, so those were all great initiatives that happened. Just on the other side, besides the disability inclusion component, we also got the Minister of Education from Poland approached us. And on a different note, she was wanting support around refugees from the Ukraine, and they are wanting to use technology more pervasively to support education. And they were asking us in our membership if we know of anyone or any organization with specific expertise in training teachers in using technology for learning. Please send that through to myself or Jennifer. We'd really much appreciate that. And it was also really good to see that ministers of education are calling on us and asking us for advice and wanting to use the great resources in our GCE family. So that's really positive. Overall, my take on the TES is, I'm always generally an optimist, so I'm optimistic. I'm hoping that we're on a better path to transform education and move more together on making quality inclusive education a reality for everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Beate, for this absolutely fantastic insights, specifically on disability inclusive education. I think that's absolutely central for our work. Now it's time for Beate Ogard, representing the Northern Coalitions in the GCE board. So Beate, please, for 7 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Werner, and hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's really nice to be connected with everyone in the GCE movement. And I was participating at TES in New York as part of the GCE delegation on behalf of the Europe and North American Campaign for Education, but also focusing specifically on some advocacy activities related to Norway. I don't want to recap and repeat a lot of things that have already been mentioned by my colleagues, Nafisa, Samuel, and Rafat, but I thought I would share some of the key takeaways in terms of what was actually committed to a TES, and also just some overall reflections from my end. And I think just to start out that it was extremely important that TES happened. It was, as you know, the first time that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, convened an own high-level summit on education to tackle the deepening education crisis. So I think the fact that it happened was quite important, though there are many things to be said about the way it was conducted, and also to what extent it was everything that we wished for, because we put a lot of work and efforts into preparing through the different action tracks, and also through organizing a range of side events, both from GC, but also through other CSO networks, and to what extent the 7 different calls to action that was emerged or published or announced at the summit will lead to the concrete change that we need to see on the ground, and also the real political and economic commitments that we need to see from state leaders. I think that the 2 first days of the summit, with the Youth Day and the Solutions Day, were quite good. We were able to be present with civil society activists, youth activists, and different stakeholders from some private institutions, and also some government officials that participated, and especially some education ministers from a key number of countries. And a lot of engagement, but that was a huge contrast to what we experienced with the Leaders' Day on the 19th, where participation in person for civil society was a huge problem. The lack of being able to organize sufficiently from UNESCO and the TES Secretariat was a huge disappointment. Very few of the large amount of civil society representatives that have traveled to New York and is spending a quite tremendous amount of funds being able to be present, to attend the meetings, and also to engage actively in advocacy with their own governments and others. Very few were able to attend the TES Leaders' Day in person, and very little information was shared. So I have raised this already with several GCE colleagues, but I do think that we should share and raise a concern with the TES Secretariat, and also Leonardo Garnier, about the lack of civil society participation at the Leaders' Day. I was able to get in eventually to be there in person. And most of the government officials were quite active in the opening segments of the Leaders' Day, but many governments only participated in events where they had a dedicated speaking role as part of a panel or a session. And it was extremely sad to see that at the end of the day, with the closing and the presentation of the vision statement from Antonio Guterres, the General Assembly Hall was almost completely empty, and almost no states were present in the room, though they might have followed some of the meetings virtually. But I think, that really showed the huge contrast between a lot of engagement and excitement and more constructive discussions that took place on the 16th and 17th, and a very empty room and lack of interactive engagement on the 19th. So in terms of outcomes, quite a lot happened at TES. Some of these calls to action have already been mentioned, but I thought I would just run through them quickly. So there were 7 different global initiatives that were launched. Several of these came directly from the 5 different action tracks, but also to cover education and technology, financing of education, foundational learning, but there were also others dedicated to address the link between the climate crisis and education, also a specific call to action on education in crisis and on transformative gender equality in education, and one of empowering youth, which came in addition to the youth declaration that was presented. But there was, as Samuel mentioned as well, a huge lack of the teacher segment present in the meeting, which was also criticized by several actors. Other things that were launched, UNESCO and UNICEF launched a Gateways to Public Learning, which is a global multi-partner initiative to strengthen inclusive digital learning platforms and content. The UN Secretary General and the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, launched again for the first time, but actually the third time, the International Finance Facility for Education, together with the countries or the governments of Sweden, UK, and the Netherlands. And then there was a lot of exciting events that happened on the outskirts or connected to TES, but not part of the official TES agenda, but a lot of side events. And I'm not sure if all of these are available online to watch virtually, as most of the TES program is. But the Education Cannot Wait launched their new 4-year strategy and also their new case for investment. There was pledging for Education Cannot Wait happening on Saturday after TES at the Global Citizen Festival, where Germany, the Danish Lego Foundation, and also the US announced their pledges already. There was a lot of action on domestic financing of education. Some parts already covered in the recommendations that built on the discussion paper on the financing track, but also a specific commitment from the president of Ghana to follow up on the Kenyatta Declaration that was announced at the Education Summit at the GPE replenishment a while ago. So the president of Ghana announced that he would be a champion for domestic education financing and follow up to ensure that education spending would be protected and go back to the same levels as before the pandemic, with either 20% of national budgets being allocated to education, or for countries who are not yet there, that they allocate 20% of their budgets, they will slowly increase to 20% within 2025. So this was a meeting that was convened by the African Union together with other actors. And there were 12 heads of states at the meeting committing to the same agenda, but GP has also announced that around 80 or 90 ministers have committed to prioritize education from their partner countries. Also I'm sorry, Werner, I will soon wrap up. Also the Minister of Education from Sierra Leone was very active throughout TES and will also have an important follow-up role. He also committed, together with the president of Sierra Leone, to prioritize education as the main vehicle for national development. And there were other specific commitments related to the teacher gap. There will be an own teacher commission set down, which was announced by the UN Deputy Secretary General, and also a new coalition or network for gender transformative education, where both Germany and the Lego Foundation has pledged 2.4 million euros to set it up. And I know I'm speaking out of my 7 minutes, but I do think despite there being some disappointment in how the meetings were organized and lack of ownership from some of these states, a lot of important commitments were made, and we really need to follow up from DCE, and we need to make sure that we're visible and we are a strong movement to deliver, and also to hold states accountable for how they are to follow up, even if there is not an own test organized. But we need to pick up on these discussions when we meet in Johannesburg but also think in the weeks and months ahead on how to continue this momentum that was created. Thanks. I'm happy to elaborate more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, dear Beate, especially for addressing the specific outcomes. I think that's absolutely crucial. Now it is the time for listening David Archer, who will share a bit of his views on the summit, but also about the financing call to action. So David, for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Werner, and hello everyone. And if I've got 7 minutes, I think I'll focus my time on talking about the finance agenda, because I think that is, first of all, is the thing which I've been most engaged with, and which I think is potentially the most transformative part of the Transforming Education Summit, in terms of, I think, quite a radical reframing about the way in which we talk about the financing of education and what needs to be done in the coming years. It's a pretty bold statement. It draws the call to action. I put the link in the chat just a little bit earlier. Is very much draws from the Action Track 5 on finance, the discussion paper that was prepared in advance of the summit. And it sort of basically calls for more investment, more equitable spending, more efficient spending, more international financial contributions, and more international support for the national efforts. And that element of international action to unblock the domestic financing, I think, is particularly significant. Look, in terms of the more investment, it starts with that, reasserting the core benchmarks, which we've all been working on for a long time, of the importance of committing 4 to 6% of GDP or 15 to 20% of national budgets to be spent to education. And it sort of emphasizes, I think, importantly, that needs to be, we need to see actual tangible increases in investment per student. And that if countries are serious about that one of the biggest areas of action has to be on tax, and increasing tax to GDP ratios through ambitious and progressive tax reforms. And that is hugely significant, and particularly for low-income countries who have an average tax to GDP ratio of about 16%. If they were to increase tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points, that would get you to a 21% tax to GDP ratio. And that would normally, in most countries, allow a doubling of spending on education and on health and on some other public services. So the transformative agenda that we want to see for education really depends on action to expand revenues to be dedicated to public services and to education in particular. And we cannot any longer get away without talking seriously about tax as being one of the centerpieces of the action that is needed. There are important statements, I think, around the importance of more equitable spending on education, including really trying to draw attention to allocations for the 40% or 20% of the families with lowest incomes in countries, and those who are most vulnerable, including children with disabilities, and those who where it might cost more to ensure that they have equitable and good quality access to education. And interestingly and importantly, I think, as well as emphasizing the importance of greater investment in early childhood education, there is a reference to the importance of investing more in lifelong learning. This is extremely unusual in this sort of, I think, international space, to really recognize that if we're transforming education, we need to talk about education for genuinely everyone, and revalidating and elevating the importance of financing adult learning as well. There are issues around more efficient spending, including about how to ensure, one of the key ways of making spending more efficient is through greater accountability, by emphasizing that, in fact, in most countries, in pretty much every country, or in all countries, in fact, the most important challenge is about workforce development and teacher workforce development, and we need to make sure that adequate financing is there to expand the public sector workforce. And often I think there's too much focus often on sector planning, but not enough about making sure the sector budgeting matches that planning and that the priorities in the budget are consistent with the wider agenda. Now, then we talk about international financial contribution. Now, in the big scheme of things, all of the aid and all of the loans is only ever going to add up to 3% of the total financing. 97% of the financing is domestic, and that's why domestic national budgets and action on tax are crucial. But it is important that we get to a point where there's a bit more of a sort of parity, a bit of a global compact, that if countries are dedicating 15 to 20% of their spending on education, actually the international aid and the share of concessional loans going to education needs to match that at 15 to 20% as well. Now, as far as I know, this is the first time in any international meeting that we've actually established an indicative benchmark that 15 to 20% share of aid ought to go to education. That would be incredibly transformative. At the moment, it's falling desperately short of that, just down to about 5.5% at the moment, and ratcheting up the amount of aid that goes to education. It's not going to happen overnight, but it does give us a reference point for campaigning, for advocacy, to make the case in all contexts, whether it's in relation to aid or in fact the share of concessional loans. That includes World Bank, IDA, putting pressure on IDA to increase the amount of concessional lending that does end up going to education. And it should be but one of the things where we can influence ministries of finance to ensure that they're using 15 to 20% of their IDA allocations to go to education. I think those are really important reference points. But I think the most exciting stuff is around the international actions that are needed to reinforce that domestic financing agenda. So if we're going to see a major breakthrough on domestic tax and financing through tax, then we have to see international action on how global tax rules are set, and how they're enforced. At the moment, it's the OECD who set the tax rules. We need to see a move towards a UN tax convention. And I was very pleased to see that just after the summit, the UN Secretary General did actually recognize and reinforce the message from the African Union Ministers of Finance that there ought to be a UN tax convention. I think that would be incredibly transformative for the financing of all public services and education in particular. And the sorts of things we need to see, that the global rules don't force countries into a race to the bottom, that there is a global asset register, that there are closing down of loopholes and of tax havens, and that we see a dramatic reduction in illicit financial flows. Because quite frankly, if governments cannot tax the richest individuals and the companies operating in their countries, how can you finance quality public services if those who have the most and should be taking the biggest burden of taxes are aggressively avoiding that responsibility? So that is an incredibly transformative agenda. And I think we expect to see some significant breakthroughs that will certainly add weight that the global education community is now calling for significant global action on tax. There has to be action on debt as well. The failure at the moment to have any credible big mechanism for debt renegotiation and debt cancellation when so many countries are spending more on debt servicing than they are on education and health. That has to change. I think the fact that that's part of the call from the education community massively reinforces pressure for reform and for global action on debt. I think the biggest challenge that we faced, in my view, going into this summit, and the biggest challenge for probably 40 years, is that in pretty much every international meeting that's ever happened on education, the people who have the biggest influence are not at the table. The people who need to change their policies are not at the table. And the people who need to be at the table are the International Monetary Fund, because they're the ones who shape how ministries of finance see investment in education. They are responsible for the sort of mindset around the financing of education. They're also responsible for imposing in most countries public sector wage bill constraints that block recruitment of new teachers. They're also responsible for advising ministries of finance about tax policies and how to expand tax revenues. apart from the fact that they only ever recommend spending cuts rather than increases in tax revenues. And when they do advise on tax, they advise regressive taxes like VAT that do pass the burden on to people living in poverty and not to the rich elite. So we've made a major call to try to get the IMF to come to the table, including Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director. She was supposed to be coming and talking on the panel that I was on. She then withdrew 2 days before the summit. We had a lovely campaign, and many thanks for all of you who reinforced that with wanted posters and missing posters. And I was very pleased to see that the day after the summit, CNN, Christiane Amanpour, in her interview with Kristalina Georgieva, directly put her on the spot and said, you were invited to this summit on education. You didn't turn up. Why weren't you there? I think that gives shows a level of visibility for the pressure that we put on the IMF. It is now, I understood, very likely that the spring meetings of the IMF World Bank will have an official part on the official agenda, the outcomes, the finance outcomes from the TES summit. I would like it to have been next week at the annual meetings, but it is now apparently going to happen in the spring meetings. And we need to make sure that that is part of the agenda year on year, every year that the annual meetings happen, that they revisit the agenda coming from the Transforming Education Summit and look at their responsibilities and accountabilities and change their policies and practices. That would be a major victory. I'm going to say one last thing. I'm sorry if I'm slightly overrunning. The last thing is that we've got to remember that this summit is part of a cycle of summits. There's going to be a summit on the SDGs next year. There's a summit on our common future around sustainability in 2024, and there's a social summit in 2025. It is my view that one of the things that should unite all those summits is this sort of transformative financing agenda, because it's not just about education, it's about all public services and all social spending. It's about the whole of the SDG agenda, which could be transformed through the sort of financing recommendations that have been laid out at TES. So one of the ways of keeping the TES agenda alive is to ensure that the way in which we've articulated this financing agenda is reasserted every year in the next 3 years in those global summits. And I think we should do what we can as a global movement on education to make that happen. But in the end, national level pressure, the national coalitions putting pressure on your own governments to take seriously this TES agenda and have a more strategic discussion on financing is the most important thing of all. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David, for addressing such important issues, including lifelong learning and early childhood education financing, as well as the increasing the aid for education and the tax convention. By the way, I think that tax convention might be considered by the GC board as one of the key campaigns for next year. Maybe that might be a very meaningful way to support this initiative. I think it's absolutely crucial. So this is something that we should consider. And also for addressing who were absent out there of the summit, including IMF. Please don't go away. I think that there might be a lot of questions for you. And now we will continue with our dear colleague from DC US, Jennifer Wick. Jennifer, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Werner. Thank you so much for organizing. Can you hear me all right? Okay, fantastic. Absolutely. Thank you for this. And I'll just share a few quick reflections with huge thanks following on the previous speakers to everybody across the entire GCE family, new partners, new coalition members who joined in the work in the lead up to TES. And as you can hear, even more so the advocacy, partnership building, and work that we have now for accountability and urging even stronger commitments to ensure the human right to quality, inclusive education for all. I wanted to share quickly a few reflections, starting with the TES Mobilization Day. I think our colleague Vicky and others might share more on the Youth Declaration, but we were thrilled across our small team and coalition members to help contribute in the crafting of the TES Youth Declaration. And really want to mention that as an important high point. Debriefing with our student and youth fellows, I think there's a key question of what happens next on the youth declaration. It felt a little showboaty to them, understandably, right? Because it was sort of officially presented. We were literally standing there as the UN Secretary General, held the box that allegedly held the pieces of paper and walked out of the room. Okay, so now what comes next? Really fantastic work happened right after TES with our colleagues at affiliated with the UN Girls Education Initiative, UNGAI, and Transforming Education, Feminist Movement, and others. But there's a real opportunity now. Our Annie Lynn, one of the fantastic student and youth fellows who spoke at a terrific GCE side event that was convened, really emphasized that it seems there are so many wonderful youth-led and student-led branches and movements, but this is a real opportunity to engage and come together to really strengthen our collective work, so that we're not just tied to those 3 days of the summit itself. On that front, I also wanted to really applaud, coming from the pre-summit in June, just a few short months ago, we know that there were real questions about civil society space and advocacy and opportunity. That's a real area to improve upon before the next TES. We did hear comments that there might be another TES in 2 years. So I totally agree with you, David. We should both be building this into upcoming moments, and not just the next global summits around the September timeframe in New York, but the UN Commission on the Status of Women, or CSW, often will happen early in each calendar year. And then we also now have the Education Cannot Wait focused work just in February, just a few months away, with the Education and Emergencies High-Level Financing Conference being hosted in Geneva. So real opportunity to build even stronger momentum. And if indeed there is a TES 2.0 in 2 years' time, I wanted to share some reflections and would love to hear from all of you about what we think we can do to improve this process and to make it better. This was, to be sure, the first time we'd had a high-level opportunity like this at UN General Assembly at UNGA, but let's really maximize that and make sure education can absolutely be a key part moving forward of this work. So you've heard a little bit, thanks to Nafisa, about the Disability Inclusive Education Call to Action. Please help us spread the word on that and join in. I also wanted to highlight, we shared it in the chat, that it's not just USAID and the World Bank. The government of Finland had a representative at that event, and then followed up also on Twitter and said, we have work to do. Let's get busy, and specifically signaled that the more governments that do sign on, or specifically also commit to getting to 100% of all education funding and programs and financing being fully disability inclusive, which to achieve the human right to quality inclusive education universally is as it should be. So encourage all of you to consider, and we'd be happy to help with this through the community of practice, focus on inclusive education and early childhood topics to help make sure that you can have whatever tools and partnership you need to be able to make that a reality and really accelerate that progress. We appreciate that challenge approach, if you will, in the sense of let's make sure that we push each other to really be reaching every person who's in need of quality inclusive education. And then on the education and emergencies front, I don't think we've mentioned yet, there was a series of sort of side events, if you will, that were youth and student led, that were hosted just a few blocks away from the United Nations headquarters, happening on the same day as the Leaders Summit. And that was through the Unlock the Future of Learning event. And we can share that in the chat if anybody would like to be able to follow those recordings. That was a space where your government representatives might have also been speaking and making commitments. And thankfully that was all recorded. I don't think there's a transcript, but those recordings are live. We help to collaborate with many others on an education and emergencies focused spotlight session. And we're pleased to share that the outcome report from that and a mobilization focused engine room, which was sort of to bring people together afterwards, that we helped to moderate. And we were grateful to World Vision International for hosting that space in New York. That outcome report just got published today. So we'll share that as well with everybody. And it's also a launch pad, a point where we'd love to hear more from all of you as to what you think going into some of these upcoming moments we can do together, building on the fantastic GCE Education and Emergencies focused Protect Education campaign over this past year, and this opportunity to secure new commitments and make sure that they are fully implemented. On that front, I wanted to really ask what we can do on the accountability side of things. I think several people have highlighted that there's a real question as to the follow-up and what comes next. Some governments did do national statements of commitment. Some followed the mobilization requests and the like from UNESCO and the TES Secretariat to hold, and really thanks to many of you, I think Rafat and others helped make a lot of those consultations at national and regional levels happen. In our circumstance, for example, our government is not a member of UNESCO yet. So we advocate on that. We work to try to address and fix that. But the reality is we would like to see all governments participate in the future more fully. I really applaud what Rafat was saying earlier. I think, I've seen this work in other sectors as well. These types of moments can be a way to strengthen civil society advocacy efforts with their governments. Ironically, of course, ideally people should be able to have those meetings at home, but sometimes when you're there as part of the same country delegation at a United Nations meeting, that can sometimes open those doors and allow for those types of partnerships, those advocacy opportunities, and engagement with policymakers to become more possible. So one thing we're looking to do as well is similarly, now that there is a test track, if you will, let's follow what has worked for World Food Summits and other sectors in the past, where technically our governments should not only be doing those national consultations, but having actual engagement with civil society before, during, and after. Some governments, I think Sierra Leone did this, could be including civil society partners, youth leaders, students in their actual official delegation to the summit as well. So there are different ways for us to dream as to how we'd like to see this happen before TES 2.0 in potentially 2 more years. I really appreciate everything that our colleagues across the UN did to make this happen quickly, and the bureaucracy, if you will, across different branches of the UN. I do urge that in the future, events should be allowed, even if there's not a UN partner or member state governments as part of the compilation and consortium putting side event proposals together. I think that was a real barrier for civil society partnership and advocacy. And then we'd like to see, like the Global Disability Summit did in February, an actual portal that's more accountable and transparent that will help to address the issues too, about even if it's through self-reporting measures, to make sure that commitments that are made have a way to really clearly be tracked, and for there to be, not to add an additional reporting burden. It could be built into part of the SDG 4 and whatever comes after the SDGs process, but to make sure that there's real clarity as to what's being committed. And indeed, that allows us to hold feet to fire and make sure that work is implemented politically across different administrations and parties and the like. So I hope that's a helpful contribution to kick off our future collaboration together, and real opportunities for deepening our advocacy efforts from the local to the national to the regional to the global levels. But huge thanks to all of you. And also, I think it was mentioned briefly, but it's a real barrier when people can only come in person. And we apologize. We know, that it's so challenging to be able to even get visas, make sure that those logistics can occur. And so we would encourage, we advocated for this. I think we were successful in some areas, but we'd like to see more of this truly be interactive, so that if somebody is, no matter where you're joining from, you can really be part of this discussion and the policy making. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And yeah, we are very sorry that Kristalina Georgieva didn't get the visa for traveling to the US. But in any case, thank you for the briefing on the side events and the accountability expectations and disability summit. So colleagues, we still have 3 speakers to go. So please bear with us and stay a little bit longer. We will have time also for questions and answers. So my next speaker is Laura Giannichini from CLADE. Laura, please go ahead.
Gracias, Bernard. Bueno, creo que los compañeros y las compañeras ya han mencionado varios de los puntos que quería destacar, pero bueno, recordar que efectivamente esta cumbre está en el marco de de un llamado a a una nueva agenda común y a la creación de un nuevo pacto por el desarrollo de un multilateralismo inclusivo, interconectado y eficaz para responder a los retos más acuciantes de la humanidad, como se dice. Y que en ese marco la organización de una reunión de alto nivel sobre educación creo que es muy importante con la convocatoria de jefes de estados, aunque este tercer día haya sido vaciado en términos de liderazgos políticos y también de la sociedad civil. Como decían los compañeros, ¿no? Esto fue un proceso y no una cumbre específica que empieza con discusiones sobre vías de acción, realiza consultas nacionales en decenas de países y en algunos países de consultas mucho más participativas que en otros, y eso también es algo que tenemos que remarcar. Bueno, una precumbre, una cumbre y ahora hay ese desafío del seguimiento. Yo creo que la cumbre fue marcada por una disputa de narrativas muy concreta sobre qué se entiende por la educación. Desde el principio ya se decía, bueno, tenemos que transformar la educación y en ese sentido no es posible solamente pensar el acceso a la educación para todas y todos. La universalidad no es suficiente. Una vez que vimos la ampliación del acceso de la educación en varias partes del mundo, pero esa educación que ahora se brinda no viene acompañada de una serie de transformaciones como disminución de desigualdades, discriminaciones, asimetrías de poder, individualismo, meritocracia. Todo eso permanece. Y bueno, lastimosamente eso se refleja en resultados electorales como el de mi país el día de ayer, ¿no? Cuando elegimos un Congreso súper conservador, más conservador de lo que veíamos, que defiende armas, que hace confusión entre los roles de la Iglesia y del Estado, pone un énfasis tremendo en el individualismo, en la meritocracia. Entonces, creo que la cumbre nos recuerda que la educación, que tenemos que transformar la educación para transformar individuos y para transformar sociedades. Y ahí veo que la tensión de narrativas en la cumbre permanece, o sea, hay en todo momento discursos más progresistas, más alineados a la perspectiva del derecho humano a la educación, pero también se ve a todo momento una narrativa conservadora, una entrada muy fuerte del sector privado que es llamado por los propios gobiernos a estar en el centro de los gobiernos. Una presentación de narrativas de soluciones de tecnología para la educación muy reduccionista, como si eso fuera resolver los problemas con llamadas telefónicas o SMS a los estudiantes. Entonces, hay una importante tensión de narrativas que creo que hay que pensar. Otro elemento que me parece que fue muy evidente fue el debilitamiento de los actores colectivos en esta cumbre. Entonces, la falta de participación de la sociedad civil de manera colectiva, organizada, es algo que llama la atención. Los jóvenes estuvieron en el centro de la cumbre. Su declaración fue interesante, fue fuerte, pero muchas de las intervenciones que ellos hicieron muchas veces fueron anecdóticas, llamando la atención para trayectorias individuales, para el privilegio que tuvieron en alcanzar la educación, pero no en una real transformación de los sistemas, una mirada desde el derecho a la educación. Y lo mismo con los docentes, que no tuvieron la visibilidad como actores colectivos, ¿no? Ellos estuvieron presentes, pero la visibilidad de los colectivos y la valoración de estos movimientos estudiantiles, de docentes, sindicatos, creo que dejó a desear, aunque a todo momento se mencionaba la importancia de la creación de un nuevo movimiento global por la educación, pero me parece que se propone la creación de un movimiento con actores individuales y menos con actores colectivos que representen una base fuerte, y eso creo que es algo que tenemos que traer para el centro de nuestra discusión como un movimiento, porque eso genera una necesidad de reflexión de cómo queremos organizarnos colectivamente. Creo que pensar las articulaciones con otros movimientos de otros campos es fundamental, es una tarea que nos queda incluso para la Asamblea de la campaña mundial. Sin duda, el financiamiento salió como una pauta fortalecida. Se reconoce el rol de los estados como principales garantes de este derecho y del financiamiento de la educación. También la importancia de la narrativa contra la deuda, la adopción de mecanismos de justicia fiscal, gastos más equitativos, como decía el compañero David Archer, pero también es incómodo ver que los mecanismos innovadores o la ausencia del FMI vienen también para el centro. Entonces creo que hay estas tensiones, estas disputas que nos obligan a repensarnos como actores colectivos y como movimiento por el derecho a la educación, y también pensar cómo hacemos el seguimiento a estos nuevos compromisos sin que la agenda de educación 2030 de manera integral pierda la centralidad de las discusiones. Eso era lo que quería aportar. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Laura, por hacer estas lecturas. Pienso que hay algunos temas fundamentales. El primero es cuál es el sentido y el significado de educación transformadora, ¿no? Yo creo que esto es un abordaje que fue realmente opaco durante la fase preparatoria y durante la cumbre. Preguntarnos para qué queremos transformar la educación es absolutamente crucial, y considerando que el mundo corporativo estuvo allí intentando transformar la educación para sus propios intereses, me parece que es una discusión de profunda actualidad. Ahora vamos a continuar la presentación con dos colegas del secretariado de la campaña que nos van a también compartir sus perspectivas. La primera de ellas es nuestra colega Vicky, que tuvo una destacada participación en la organización del segmento de jóvenes. Vicky, por favor.
Thank you, Werner, and hi, everyone. Yes, so as Werner mentioned, my name is Vicky from the GC Secretariat. I work on youth and student engagement. So for my overview, I just want to give a brief update on the launch of the Youth Declaration during TES. The Youth Declaration, as you all know, and as was mentioned, was launched on Mobilization Day on September 16th. And for some context, it is presented as a document that represents young people's inputs into the TES Summit Chair Summary, as well as the Secretary General's vision statement. And its aim is to drive really political commitment on the need to transform education, but also to build young people's ownership over the process. So as some of you know, the declaration was drafted as part of a consultative process with youth and students globally. So it included an initial consultation at the pre-summit in Paris, and then 2 other consultations between June and August 2022. And young people also self-organized around grassroots consultations, gathering views and recommendations on the local level of young people. So there were over 15 grassroots consultations organized. In terms of the reactions, I think the youth declaration does mark a significant moment in committing, or at least sharing that commitment to ensure youth and students are primary decision makers. But there are still some gaps, including, of course, accountability, the accountability question, which has been mentioned, and how to actually action the youth declaration. So what is actually going to be done to ensure that the demands within this declaration are there's intergenerational core decision making, as well as youth actually being involved in decision making processes. So it's this idea of that inclusion is not enough, solidarity is not enough, but there's a need to go beyond that towards youth action and youth-led decision making. In terms of the key messages within the declaration, it does encompass the key priorities for education based on the consultations and from the voices of youth and students globally. So some of the key messages include, investment in youth leadership, decolonizing and democratizing knowledge and education systems, gender transformative education, provision of comprehensive sexuality education, inclusive education, climate change, addressing climate change, mental health, digital skills, education for refugees and migrants, and more. But I think the overarching message and the key message from the declaration is that young people are calling to be meaningfully engaged, and the key word is obviously meaningfully, and to be full-fledged kind of partners in education policy, in decision-making, working alongside governments, NGOs, and the UN and others on transforming education. And as I mentioned, there's a need to go beyond, inclusion and solidarity to really youth and students should actually be at the decision-making tables. For example, on the 19th, it shouldn't just be one isolated day for youth and students and then they're not kind of included in the being brought to the tables with decision makers. They should have equal footing and power in creating these education policies. And I think this is something that could be emphasized more within the Youth Declaration. But I think now the work really begins, and this can be something that's included in the action steps moving forward, and how we hold decision makers accountable for on this Youth Declaration. Regarding what's next, some reflections as well from some youth and students within GCE and from Secretariat as well, in terms of holding policymakers and decision makers accountable on the national level, firstly locally. There's a need to adapt these demands. They're very global, very broad, but how do we adapt them to national and local contexts for each country so that youth and students are actually being involved within their national governments, with the actual decision makers, and being given those spaces for national level advocacy. On the international level, youth and student advocates should continue to actively support in solidarity ongoing campaigns and amplify the declaration's demands. And then following up with the SDG4 Youth Network, as was mentioned in the Youth Declaration, to take these demands forward beyond the summit. So they mentioned there'll be an action plan, so ensuring that we hold them accountable to this action plan as well. So in terms of just some commitments from GCE, the GCE side as well, towards this accountability, I think we can commit to raising awareness on these demands, but also just, as I said, adapting them to our contexts, and also following up and creating these accountability mechanisms for the SDG4 youth, as well as decision makers and policy makers. So raising awareness. GCE will also plan to host, a deep dive on the Youth Declaration implementation with youth and students globally, And then lastly, it's just encouraging all GCE members to collaborate and coordinate with youth advocacy networks to achieve or to set up strategic next steps to advocate in solidarity towards actionable steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for this very useful feedback. As you know, we have been pushing for fighting this tokenistic approach to youth participation. So GC has been working on strengthening constituency-based youth participation, and so this is very much our focus. So thank you, Vicky. And now, last but not least, Luis Eduardo Perez Murcia, our research manager, will debrief on our side event, where we launched the Education Financing Observatory. The floor is yours, Luis Eduardo. And following that, we will have the open discussion. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Werner. Thank you very much. I am aware the time is running out, so I will try to be brief. So we have our Education Financing Observatory, the possibility to launch the observatory at this very important event. And generally speaking, I think it was really good. We have the possibility to hear the Minister of Argentina, the Minister of Malawi, and a representative from the Gulf states who all highlighted the importance of financing education at the domestic level, but also in some of these speeches, in particular the Malawi Minister of Education, at the international level, advocating for more financing for contests dealing with debt crisis and with emergencies. So far, I believe the session went good. We received some kind of very good comments. All the three representatives from the government were willing to learn more about the observatory and invited us to share with them the tool because they really want to start working. Some of them already have been doing so, to work with national coalitions and to really follow the process of financing education at the different levels. Beyond that, I want to take this opportunity to really question some of the assumptions maybe we are making when taking part in these important summits. One of the assumptions is really connect with Laura Gianginetti mentioned about what the transformation for education for. Basically, we hear very little about in the ways education should be transformed, in particular from the process of learning. So we don't really know about, for example, what the governments or what are the commitments in terms of developing strategies for critical learning. And in particular, in the process of digitalization of the education, we are really talking about just reproducing things, but little analysis of how people engage with critical thinking, critical learning, and all these very elements that are central to the discussions of education, not only in terms of the classroom, but also in terms of education policy. And I have to say that we are assuming many things here. And one that is connected to the discussion we had in the observatory is that for many years, we are just talking about the 4 to 6%, the 20%, and the 10% of how the world is financing education. But in reality, when we look at the figures closely for countries living in emergencies, and living in emergencies not just this year, but for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we know that this don't work. So what is the meaning of a new agenda or a new financing architecture for those countries? In South Asia Pacific and in many countries or regions, the average from the international community is about 45%. And in some places in Africa, 60% of the financing for education really depends on international ID. And we can find that there are kind of a perverse ways of thinking in that ways in the governments, because most of the focus of the discussion is for children and youth. So we can say that just waiting that they become older or adults, better to say, and they will have no longer the right to education in a sense that they are not protected because countries are saying we need to invest primarily on children and youth. And what is next? So we have lots of talents, people there living in emergencies for many years, and then when they grew up, they no longer have really the expectation of their countries protect the right to education, and the international community neither. And here we also need to talk about the inequalities in terms of the financing for education is distributed among countries in emergency. And maybe we have seen, or to have the possibility to attend the summit, there were lots of sessions about Ukraine. We are all very aware of the difficult situations Ukrainians are facing now, but when we look at how the financing for education in the country is going, so we see that most of the financing that were discussed in the consortium, for example, for early childhood education, are going to Ukraine. And I would like to say that this is so important. I am very much agree that the country needs resources, and I am very, keen to see that this happen. But my question is, who really cares about those millions of children living in Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Somalia, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Iraq, to mention just some examples? They are not receiving the funding. I am very impressed that only three projects were accepted for Somalia, a country where people are just starving and dying because of hunger, school destroyed, conflict, and all these kind of things. So equality is a very important issue here. We attend this summit and we believe that, yes, education, equality, non-discrimination, but when the findings are presented, when the discussion are presented, they are only focusing on some countries. Just to give you a very important example, Poland has been recognized in the heart of Europe for their policy against migrants and against refugees. But the very Minister of Education of Poland just presented a wonderful initiative. She said something like, we want that Ukrainians, our brothers and sisters, feel in Ukraine at home, and we want that all children, Ukrainian children, feel at home in our schools. The question was, what about the Syrians? What about all the Africans risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean? Are they also welcome to Poland? Are they also welcome to feel at home in the schools? This is not really true, and we need to follow on that, because many of the countries are just pushing migrants and refugees to other places. And we are maybe all aware what is happening now in the discussion in the UK, when deporting people to Rwanda and giving them the money, just keeping them then outside Europe. So what are the things here? In what way we are transforming education? We are supposing to transform education for the better for every human being, and that includes migrants, internally displaced people, refugees, and all the living crisis. But at the same time, we are narrowing the politics of migration and education just to keeping them in their place when they are not white. That is the issue about racism and discriminations in the heart of Europe at this very moment. And finally, I want to mention something that David just highlighted for a bit, is that we have discussion now about youth, about children, but not very much about early childhood education, and definitely not at all as soon as so about adult education. We are talking all the time about lifelong learning, but we don't have a space, for example, for elderly people to be part of this session, to share their experience and to highlight the importance of education for adults. And I believe we are just kind of creating a space in which everything now is, we need youth advocates and children advocates and all these kind of things. But where are the adults in those discussions? Most of the teachers are adults already, people aging in this context with lots of struggle, and their voices are not here in these kind of political spaces. So thank you very much, Bernard, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Luis Eduardo, for this super sharp feedback, and especially for making the point of the lack of universalization of the right to education, meaning how the funding is not reaching the most marginalized and how many elderly persons are still lacking to find responses to their education rights and needs. So fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, so we have some time for comments, for open discussion, for questions and answers. So I would invite those who want to share, just raise your hand and I will give the floor. So the floor is open to everyone who wants to start.
I was the last, and I probably want to take the chance of this question. I do think, and this is a very personal thing, that in this kind of summits, we just really feel this kind of colonial perspective, trying to suggest that the problems are in the so-called global south and everything is going well in the north, but this is not really true. And when we engage, for example, in discussions about the digitalization of education, and recent data suggests how minority communities, ethnic communities in central London are just far away from getting the device, the technological issues that they require to engage in education. So even in the most powerful economies, those disadvantaged, and here intersect gender, class, ethnicity, are really left behind. As we are a global movement, we also need to be careful about protecting and advocating for the right to education of all the people in the global south, but also those minority ethnic groups who are discriminating against for their belonging, for they suffer many things, who are left behind in powerful economies. I am talking about the examples of Norway, Sweden, the UK, and we can just bring more and more examples.
Thank you very much, Luis Eduardo. So everyone is entitled to comment or answer any questions. So yeah. So I have Boaz and then Julie. Boaz, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Veno, and the team. And I think for me, first things first, we really need to appreciate and congratulate the team that ensured that civil society mobilization within the framework of the global movement for education was really intensified. Indeed, I'm very happy because if you're seeing, I'm about to say for the first time, but I'm seeing I witnessed intensified engagement and people who are taking leadership roles also willing really to be available and to engage with the members of the various levels of the movement, including national coalitions, regional networks like when ANSEFA did organize for the preparatory update or just updating people towards the main event, towards the summit. I think it was very, very useful. Could see the GC taking lead, David Asher being there, so that was very, very important. But there's something that I think we may now then want to take into consideration and run ahead of everybody else with, because in the conceptualization and framing of the Transforming Education Summit and the various tracts that have been created, I think it would be important for us then to start looking at the aspect of the quality and inclusion. Why? Because where I'm coming from in Africa, a lot of exclusion is still really being witnessed and all that. And so there's this opportunity that TES has really opened, which makes it very current, makes it attractive, and many partners would be willing really to join us in running ahead of the others. I don't want to say running away with, I think running ahead would be a better term. Two, the financing component is a time when almost everywhere they talk about the economic meltdown and all that, and most of our countries are really cash strapped. And so how then do we innovatively engage and look at how do we regenerate and help redirect government's efforts to mobilize local resources, the taxations and all that. But beyond even that, ensuring that our local resources in themselves are exploited and directed to the social sector, starting with education, health, and the rest. So I think I'm looking at where we are giving ourselves assignment to run ahead with key deliverables, and so as to bring the other stakeholders really to act on the same. So that's I think what I wanted to say, and because I know you really are looking for time for others also to say something, but I appreciate the work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Boaz. Let's try to make a little more brief the interventions, maybe 2 minutes. Julie Juma, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Werner. And thank you all for the presentations you have made. Very good reflections on the TES. I would just like to echo the sentiments of those who have expressed their dissatisfaction of civil society being excluded from the Leaders' Day. I was one of those who was present there, but had to sit in my hotel room and watch the proceedings. I think that is not on, and we really need to ensure that something is done about that to allow civil society to participate after spending so much to attend the summit. I had put my question in the chat, but I will raise it. It's on the IFID, on education financing. In the UN General Secretary's vision statement, we have the IFID highlighted as one of the initiatives. GCE has had previously been critical of IFID. So what I wanted us to discuss is how are we going to take this forward? Because I noted even for those people who were present at the TES when IFID was being launched, most people had walked out. So I think it's critical as a GCE movement, we agree on how best we're going to handle this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess that maybe Grant or Rifat would be able to react for that, but just let me quickly say that, I mean, it was very difficult being Gordon Brown, the special envoy, and at the same time, the leader of the Global Business Coalition for Education, and the most important person pushing for the IFID. It was kind of difficult to get rid of the IFID initiative, but maybe David can add a little bit more on that.
Yeah.
So David, please go ahead.
I mean, this was something we were grappling with throughout the whole finance track, because Gordon Brown is the UN Special Envoy for Education still, though hopefully he won't be forever. You know, he had a very close relationship with the Secretary General, and so he had already, in fact, in the framing of TES, there had been agreement that one of the things it would do was to launch IFID. So what we tried to do in the finance track was to basically put that into a tiny little box at one side and say that's just a little thing over there. The big finance agenda is the one that we're talking about. And I think we were reasonably successful, although of course Gordon's PR has made IFID much more high profile than in my view it should be. My own take is that IFID will die a death on its own. The World Bank dislikes IFID and will not get behind it. He's dependent on the Asian Development Bank, principally, a little bit on African Development Bank, but the Asian Development Bank are really the only ones significantly behind it. And the only government that is explicitly behind it is the UK government, which is now run by a bunch of extreme right-wing nutters, who I don't think Gordon Brown should have anything to do with. It's rather bizarre. The Swedish government, now also in the far right, have indicated some support, and the Netherlands put some money in 2019 and have been very clear they won't put any more money in. I don't think the donors are going to go behind it, so I think it's going to just collapse on its own, and one of our best strategies is just to ignore it, and to focus attention and talk about the stuff that really matters if we're serious about changing the financing, and that is the bigger agenda around tax, debt, austerity, challenging macroeconomic policies and engaging with the IMF. My biggest frustration in the summit as a whole was that Gordon Brown was somebody who could have used his weight and his voice to engage with ministries of finance on those strategic issues, and he wasted that in trying to advance his own initiative, which is really marginal and will probably fail. On a wider point, I do think one of our biggest challenges is about how we make sure that the GCE movement and the existing movement for education, which is GCE, the regional platforms, the national coalitions, the Global Student Forum, the Global Teacher Movement through Education International, are at the core of the movement that comes out of TES. And the Lego Foundation are very significant in framing how that is perceived, and we need to sustain a serious engagement with them and make sure that they reinforce this existing movement and don't just start something as some sort of loose-knit parallel thing which sees any young voice as a legitimate voice, even when those young voices are being really channeled through international NGOs or international institutions as ambassadors, but where they don't necessarily represent a constituency. We need to demand that youth engagement is representative youth movements and student unions at the core of what comes, and that the way in which that organized and representative movements of youth engage with the wider existing education movements. I think we can still win this argument, but we need to be very concerted in the coming period. We need the Assembly at the end of November to be a space where we really re-energize this movement and win the argument that this movement is ready to make the transformations necessary to deliver on the full agenda coming out of TES. And part of that is about how we make strategic connections with related movements, with tax and fiscal justice movements, with debt movements, with other public service movements, because we're all so interdependent. And the more that we can strengthen our connections with other movements, the more legitimate we will be in taking forward this agenda. And I'll leave it at that for now. Back to you, Werner.
Thank you so much, David. Now I'll give the floor to Marcela. Marcela, please go ahead.
Hola, buenos días a todos, todas. Muchas gracias por esta oportunidad y también por esta especie de rompecabezas donde cada persona que presentó trajo como una parte de lo que sucedió allí. La preocupación que quiero resaltar es un poco lo que ya planteó inicialmente Laura, que es cuál es la visión de transformación de educación que tenemos. Y no nosotros, por supuesto que estamos acá, pero sí desde la actoría social que estuvo ahí presente, en particular quienes toman las decisiones. Entre todas las cosas que nos llamaron la atención y que fue traído por cada uno de ustedes, es que la sociedad civil tiene una enorme cantidad de experiencias que apuntan a la transformación de la educación en los territorios y que esas experiencias estuvieron ausentes, experiencias que pueden llevarse a escala, que pueden transformarse en política pública y que mayormente las experiencias que fueron traídas desde las empresas, ¿no? Cuando las empresas eran protagonistas de esas experiencias. En segundo lugar, ver cómo podemos hacer seguimiento, digamos, quienes trabajamos en las agendas internacionales vemos cómo se firman compromisos, se hacen discursos muy interesantes, pero que luego no tienen ninguna contrapartida, ninguna relación con lo que sucede en los países, con las decisiones que se toman y sobre todo preocupa en un contexto de profundo avance de los gobiernos de derecha. Entonces ahí tenemos que ver cómo nosotros como movimiento global y cada una de las coaliciones que formamos parte de la campaña mundial podemos incidir de una manera más directa, trabajar en los territorios, darnos un plan estratégico para poder incidir y que no sean eventos uno tras otro, interesantes. Por supuesto siempre hay cosas interesantes que ocurren, pero que luego, como decía recién, no tienen ningún correlato con las decisiones que se toman. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, querida Marcela. Now, last but not least, our dear colleague Rashida.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, particularly GC, for organizing this one and the colleagues who spoke before me. Wonderful. But I just have two things to say. One, I was there. But what was mentioned earlier, not everyone was allowed to be in the Leaders Summit. This is one. And the other thing that was very, very prominent, that most of the, participation, particularly in sessions as speakers or something, national level NGOs were almost absent. And the governments, they have not included, as mentioned earlier, as the civil society as part of the delegation. But even within the UN system, I started having the feeling that even the UN has been reinforcing sort of the continuing democratic space, lack of continuing democratic space for civil society everywhere. The other point that I would like to mention, what was mentioned by Eduardo, that the focus of ODA for education is now, shifted to other priority areas. So education has always been part of a political agenda, but now the political agenda has been, a little shadowy. So in terms of following up on commitments, we need GCE to campaign for including community voices and civil society voices in terms of fulfilling their commitments. Thanks, GCE, for taking the lead in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Rashida. It was very, very good to see you there and always enjoying your contribution. Okay, colleagues, I don't have anybody else in my list, meaning that maybe we can go to the closing of this webinar. For this, I will invite our global coordinator, Grant Casawangete, to close the call. Go ahead, Grant.
Okay, thank you so much, Vena, and thanks so much, everyone. I think, TES has actually brought GCE to be as strong as it should be. I think it was very exciting for those of us that were watching, to see how various GCE members were engaged in various processes, leading certain discussions and also leading in preparing of the action track papers, that were the cornerstone of what this event was all about. As we have discussed and shared on many times, that TES is not necessarily just an event; it is the start of a process. And we are so excited from the Secretariat that we as a movement, we are part of that process. I would like to pick where David said that, GCE has to be part of this, and we have to lead in many fronts, in youth, as well as at the national level, at the regional, as well as even at the global level. I think we do have the necessary infrastructure and capacity to do that. And I think, that was really demonstrated, in the way that we organized our events and also our participation within the TES. But something that is very important that really comes out to me every time is that, most of these TES processes, they will end up at the national level. So there's a need for us as GCE to really strengthen our engagement at the national level. We have seen a shift in the way some of the multilateral institutions are functioning, like, for example, the Global Partnership for Education, the Education Cannot Wait, and many others that are really strengthening their national level processes. And I think it is so important for GCE to do that, to ensure that, whatever was discussed during the TES, that, within our national coalitions, they are able to engage and be able to discuss and debate and hold governments to account, because that's where that action really happens. As GCE, we will be supporting all of these processes to ensure that, our members are well equipped to engage in various conversations. There will be various webinars, there will be various toolkits that we're going to be producing that will actually help, in strengthening our capacities at the national level. We have done so well in many instances, and this is not something new. This is something that is our bread and butter. I hope that we are going to engage meaningfully in those processes. We have to protect education. We have to guard education, and there can't be any education if there is no financing. So we really need to ensure that there's adequate financing. We really need to ensure that the conversation around financing that emerge in TES, that we are able to continue with those conversations. We hope that the IMF and the others that were shining away from those processes, they will come to the table so that we can begin to engage meaningfully on what and how education should be financed. When we talk of transformative education, even as GCE, we really have to have our own understanding and nuancing of what does that mean. We really need to package something, and I hope that linking this to the World Assembly, that through the World Assembly, we're going to unpack some of this conversation so that we can map a clear way forward on how we as the GCA movement, we're going to engage in that. We will have the opportunity of having the Deputy Secretary General for the UN. Hopefully, she will be able to come to the World Assembly. She has already made a commitment to that. And that will be a good link and a good continuation of the TES conversation so that we can really showcase on what GCE will contribute. Yes, at times, it is good to problematize issues, but I think, the most important part is we as GCE, we have to come up with a process on what is it that, we are going to do, what is it that, we are going to contribute, towards the whole process of transforming education. So thank you so much for all your contributions. Thank you so much for your inputs, and thank you so much for representing GCE that well. You really made us proud. We were so happy to see many of you engaging in various aspects, and we look forward to the November GCE event. If you haven't registered already, please do register, because what we can promise you is that it will be a very interesting World Assembly where we are going to debate on the current educational issues and come up with the education that we as a GCE want to see. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening, morning, and time. Over to you, Ben.
Well, no, thank you so much to all. I just want to also thank our colleague Salman Pilani for making this possible, and for the interpreters who made a fantastic job. So that's all from my side. Have a fantastic day. Keep safe and happy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.